The satellite phone crackled to life at 6:23 a.m., March 15th, 2023, in the operations tent of Expedición Huascarán, a commercial climbing outfit based in Huaraz, Peru. The voice on the other end belonged to Miguel Santos, their lead guide, calling from somewhere above 14,000 feet in the Cordillera Blanca. "Base camp," he said, his words punctuated by wind and the sound of his own breathing. "We found something up here, something that shouldn't exist." Miguel had been guiding climbers through these mountains for 27 years. He'd seen bodies emerge from glaciers, ancient pottery scattered by rock slides, the occasional Incan artifact that made archaeologists' hearts race. He wasn't a man given to exaggeration or wonder. When he spoke, expedition leaders listened. "What kind of something?" asked Rosa Vega, the expedition coordinator. The silence stretched long enough that she thought they'd lost the connection. Then Miguel's voice returned, quieter now, as if he were afraid of being overheard. "There's a woman here," he said, "alive. Been missing for years, according to what she's saying. And Rosa, she's not alone. There are things in here with her, things that don't belong in any museum I've ever seen." That call would change everything. Within hours, it would draw the attention of Peruvian National Police, international archaeological teams, and eventually the kind of investigators who specialize in cases where the evidence doesn't fit the available explanations. But at 6:23 a.m. on that March morning, it was just Miguel Santos, a practical man with calloused hands and 30 years of mountain experience, trying to find words for something that had no name in any language he knew. The discovery had happened by accident, the way most impossible things do. Miguel's team had been attempting a new route up Huascarán Norte when the weather turned. March was late in the climbing season, and the afternoon storms had been building earlier and hitting harder than the forecast predicted. They'd been forced to shelter in what looked like a natural cave opening, a narrow cleft in the rock face that offered protection from the wind and sleet. But it wasn't a cave. The opening was maybe 4 feet wide, Miguel would tell investigators later. Just a crack in the mountain, the kind of thing you see everywhere up there. But when I squeezed through to check how deep it went, for safety, you understand, in case the weather got worse, I realized it wasn't natural. The walls were too smooth, too deliberate. Behind him, his 3 clients had followed. David Park, a software engineer from Seoul who'd paid $8,000 for this climb. Ana Mendes, a Brazilian doctor celebrating her 50th birthday, and Johan Eriksson, a Swedish photographer documenting high-altitude climbing for National Geographic. What they found inside violated everything Miguel understood about these mountains. The passage led not into a simple cave, but into a constructed space, a chamber carved from living rock with precision that made his flashlight beam dance across surfaces that belonged in a cathedral, not on a windswept peak at 14,000 feet. The walls bore carvings, symbols that seemed to shift in the moving light. But that wasn't what made his breath catch in his throat. There were stairs, hand-carved steps leading deeper into the mountain, disappearing beyond the reach of their lights into a darkness that seemed to swallow their LED beams, and from somewhere in that darkness came the sound of human movement. "Hello?" Miguel had called, his voice echoing strangely in the carved space. The echoes came back wrong, too many of them from directions that didn't make geometric sense. That's when she appeared. Doctor. Sienna Caldwell emerged from the shadows like someone walking out of a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. She moved slowly, uncertainly, one hand trailing along the carved wall for support. Her clothes, khaki expedition pants and a long-sleeved field shirt, were intact but faded, as if they'd been bleached by years of underground air. Her dark hair hung past her shoulders, longer than it had been in any of the missing person photos that would soon flood the international news. But it was her eyes that Miguel remembered most clearly. They held a kind of distant focus, like someone listening to music only she could hear. "You're real," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "I wasn't sure. Sometimes they send images, tests, but you're actually real." Miguel's English was functional but limited. Ana Mendes, the Brazilian doctor, stepped forward and repeated Miguel's question in Portuguese, then Spanish. "I'm Dr. Sienna Caldwell," she said in accented Spanish that suggested academic training rather than street fluency. "University of Chicago. I need to know what year it is." The question hung in the thin mountain air like a challenge. 2023, Ana told her. March 2023. The woman who called herself Sienna Caldwell sat down on the carved steps as if her legs had simply stopped working. 7 years, she whispered. They said it would only be weeks. They promised it would only be weeks. That's when David Park, the software engineer, noticed the objects. They were arranged along the walls of the chamber like museum displays or perhaps offerings, metallic pieces that caught and held their flashlight beams, reflecting the light in ways that seemed to multiply it, amplify it, bend it into patterns that made the eye water to follow. Some were clearly tools, implements with handles and working edges, though their purpose was unclear. Others defied classification entirely. "What are those?" Johann asked, his photographer's eye drawn to the impossible geometry of the objects. Sienna looked where he was pointing, and something shifted in her expression. Fear, maybe, or reverence. "Gifts," she said. "Or maybe payment." I never understood the distinction. They tried to explain, but human language doesn't have the right concepts. We don't think in the right dimensions. She pulled herself to her feet and walked to the nearest display, her movements careful and deliberate. In her hands was a leather journal bound with what looked like sinew, its pages thick with writing. "I documented everything," she said, holding the journal against her chest like a talisman. "Every day, every contact, every impossible thing they showed me. I was trained to be objective, to record and analyze and categorize, but how do you categorize something that exists outside the categories?" Miguel had spent enough time in the mountains to recognize altitude sickness, hypothermia, the various ways the thin air and brutal environment could affect human psychology. But this felt different. Sienna Caldwell spoke like someone who had seen things that didn't fit into the world as most people understood it. "We need to get you down the mountain," Ana said, her medical training taking precedence. "You need food, water, medical attention." "I know." Sienna's voice carried a sadness that seemed too deep for the immediate circumstances. "I've known for... It's hard to explain. Time moves differently here. They showed me how it works, the relationship between consciousness and duration, but I can't..." She stopped, shook her head. "You wouldn't believe me anyway. No one will." That's when Miguel made the call to base camp. While he spoke to Rosa Vega, the others explored the chamber more carefully. What they found would complicate every official investigation that followed. The temple, for lack of a better word, extended much further than that first chamber. The stairs led down into a complex of interconnected rooms carved from the mountain's heart, each one filled with objects that challenged basic assumptions about pre-Columbian civilization. The metallurgy alone was staggering. Johann photographed pieces that seemed to be made from alloys that required industrial temperatures to create, yet showed tool marks that suggested handcrafting by individual artisans. More troubling were the modern objects integrated into the displays. Sienna's own equipment from her 2016 expedition was there. Her GPS unit, her digital camera, her collection bags and sample containers arranged with the same reverence as the ancient artifacts. But they had been modified, opened, reconfigured in ways that made no functional sense but created disturbing aesthetic patterns. "Why is your camera here?" David asked, pointing to a Nikon D5600 that had been partially disassembled and rebuilt into something that might have been sculpture or might have been some kind of instrument. Sienna's laugh carried no humor. "They're anthropologists," she said. "That's the closest English word. They study us. Learn from us, the objects we carry, the way we arrange our environment, the patterns we create without conscious thought. It all tells them things about human consciousness that they can't learn any other way." "They?" But Sienna had moved on to another display, this one containing what appeared to be star charts, maps of constellations that didn't match any known astronomical configuration, drawn with mathematical precision on material that felt like paper but responded to touch like metal. I tried to explain our calendar system, she said, running her fingers over the charts. Our way of measuring time, dividing it into units that make sense to human psychology. They were fascinated. They experienced duration differently, more like we experience space as something you can move through in any direction. The idea that we're trapped in forward motion, that we experience moments sequentially. She trailed off. Anna knelt beside her, the doctor's concern evident. Sienna, how long since you've eaten? Had clean water? Time isn't... Sienna closed her eyes, took a breath. Yesterday, I think, or maybe weeks ago. They don't eat the way we do. They tried to show me their methods, but human biology isn't compatible. I survived on what I brought and what little they could provide, but it was never enough, never quite right. The evidence of that was visible. Sienna Caldwell had been a healthy 38-year-old woman when she disappeared in 2016. The person sitting before them now appeared to be in her mid-40s, her face gaunt, her body showing signs of chronic malnutrition. Yet she moved and spoke with the precision of someone whose mind remained sharp, focused. "We need to go," Miguel announced, ending his radio conversation. "Weather's clearing, but not for long. If we're going to get down safely, we leave now." As they prepared to evacuate the chamber, Sienna gathered her journal and a small collection of the artifacts. Pieces she said were gifts intended for the outside world. "They want you to see these," she explained, wrapping the objects carefully in cloth from her pack. "That's why they let me go. Not because I escaped, not because I was rescued, because it's time." "Time for what?" Sienna looked back into the depths of the temple toward passages that extended further into the mountain than their lights could penetrate. "To make contact." The descent from 14,000 feet took 6 hours. 6 hours of careful navigation down ice fields and rock faces, with Sienna moving like someone remembering how to exist in normal gravity, normal time, normal physics. She spoke little during the climb, conserving energy, but when she did speak, her words carried implications that made the others exchange glances. "The temple isn't Incan," she said during one rest stop, her voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "It's older, much older. But it was built by humans, modified and expanded by others, but originally human. They've been using places like this for..." The concept doesn't translate well. "Millennia, but not consecutively. They return periodically, when certain conditions align." "What kind of conditions?" Johann asked, his photographer's curiosity overriding caution. "Consciousness density," Sienna said, as if the phrase made perfect sense. "Population levels, technological development, the rate at which human awareness is expanding, they monitor these things, and when we reach certain thresholds..." She gestured back toward the temple they'd left behind. By the time they reached base camp, word had already spread. Rosa Vega had made the necessary calls to local authorities, to the university contacts who might understand the archaeological implications, to the missing persons databases that had carried Sienna Caldwell's name for 7 years. But she'd also made other calls, to people who specialized in cases where the evidence didn't fit standard categories. Detective Augusto Pizarro of the Peruvian National Police received the call at his office in Lima at 4:17 p.m. He'd been investigating what the department classified as unusual disappearances for 12 years. Cases involving researchers, explorers, and tourists who vanished in Peru's remote regions under circumstances that defied conventional explanation. The Caldwell case had crossed his desk in 2016, had remained open despite the lack of viable leads. "She's alive?" he asked Rosa Vega, his pen already moving across a notepad. "Very much so, but sir, this isn't a standard recovery. There are complications." Pizarro had learned to pay attention when mountain guides used words like complications. "What kind of complications?" "Archaeological, scientific. She's claiming contact with..." "Well, I think you should speak with her directly." Within 3 hours, Pizarro was on a helicopter bound for Huaraz, accompanied by a medical team, a forensic specialist, and Dr. Carmen Vasquez, an archaeologist from the University of San Marcos who had worked with Sienna Caldwell on previous expeditions. The reunion between Dr. Vasquez and her former colleague would be recorded for official purposes, though the recording would later be classified at levels that made it unavailable to academic researchers or journalists. "Sienna," Dr. Vasquez said, her voice thick with emotion as she embraced the woman who had been missing for 7 years. "We looked for you. Everyone looked. We never stopped hoping, but I know." Sienna's response was gentle but distant. "Time moves differently up there. What felt like weeks to me was years down here. But I was safe, Carmen. I was learning things that will change everything we understand about human history, about our place in—" She stopped, studying her old friend's expression. "You don't believe me." "I want to believe you," Dr. Vasquez said carefully. "But Sienna, you've been missing for 7 years. We need to understand what happened, where you've been, who had you." That's when Sienna opened her journal and began to show them the contents. The writing covered every available space on each page. Margins, headers, spaces between lines, text in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and languages that Dr. Vasquez couldn't immediately identify. But more striking were the drawings, star charts, mechanical diagrams, architectural sketches of impossible spaces, and detailed anatomical studies of forms that bore no resemblance to any known species. "I tried to document everything," Sienna said, turning pages carefully. "Every interaction, every piece of information they shared, but human language isn't adequate. Our concepts are too limited. I had to invent new terminology, create new frameworks for understanding what I was experiencing." Detective Pizarro leaned closer, his investigator's eye catching details that troubled him. "This handwriting," he said, "it changes. Early entries are neat, controlled. Later ones become more frantic." "I was fighting to maintain objectivity," Sienna explained. "But the longer I stayed, the more I realized that objectivity itself was a limitation. They don't separate observer from observed the way we do. They experience reality as participatory, not passive. Understanding them required abandoning human cognitive frameworks." Dr. Vasquez studied one of the star charts, her brow furrowed. "These constellations, they don't match anything in our sky." "Because they're not from our sky. Not exactly. They show our stellar configurations from different temporal perspectives. What our constellations looked like thousands of years ago, what they'll look like thousands of years from now. Time isn't linear for them. They experience past and future as navigable dimensions." The medical examination that followed raised more questions than it answered. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the emergency physician who evaluated Sienna, found evidence of chronic malnutrition, dehydration, and muscle wasting consistent with extended captivity or isolation. But there were anomalies. Unusual mineral deposits in her hair and nails, trace elements in her blood that suggested exposure to compounds not found naturally on Earth. "Her cellular aging is accelerated," Dr. Rodriguez reported to Detective Pizarro. "Consistent with someone in their mid-40s, not someone who should be 38, but the pattern is strange. Some organs show more aging than others, as if different parts of her body experience time at different rates." Meanwhile, the artifacts Sienna had brought down from the temple were undergoing preliminary analysis at a secure facility in Lima. The initial reports troubled everyone involved. Dr. Hugo Ramirez, Peru's leading expert in pre-Columbian metallurgy, spent 16 hours examining just 3 pieces before submitting his preliminary findings. "The alloy composition is unprecedented," he wrote. "These pieces contain metals in combinations that shouldn't exist with pre-industrial technology: titanium, chromium, rare earth elements that require sophisticated extraction processes. Yet the tool marks, the craftsmanship patterns, are consistent with hand-forging techniques. It's as if someone with Stone Age tools had access to 21st century materials." More troubling was the behavior of the artifacts themselves. "They respond to electromagnetic fields in ways I can't explain," Dr. Ramirez continued. "When we subjected them to various forms of radiation, they not only absorbed the energy, they seemed to amplify and redirect it in patterns that suggest some form of internal structure. Not mechanical, but not random either. As if they're designed to interact with forces we don't fully understand." Word of the discovery spread despite official attempts to control information flow. By March 20th, international media outlets were reporting on the miracle recovery of Dr. Sienna Caldwell. Conspiracy theorists and treasure hunters were booking flights to Peru. Academic institutions were demanding access to the artifacts and the temple site. But Detective Pizarro was focused on more immediate questions. Who were they? He asked Sienna during their third formal interview. The beings who held you. Can you describe them? Sienna was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Physical description is almost meaningless, she said finally. They exist in more dimensions than we do. What I saw of them, what my human visual system could process, was just a projection, like a shadow cast by something much more complex. But you saw something. Yes. Tall. Maybe 7 feet, but height is relative when you're dealing with beings who experience space differently. They had what looked like hands, but with too many joints, too much flexibility. Their faces, she shook her head, not faces, communication interfaces. They could alter their appearance to make interaction easier, but I never saw what they actually looked like. I don't think human perception is capable of seeing them as they really are. How many? I don't know. Sometimes one, sometimes several. But I got the impression that individual identity isn't as important to them as it is to us. They seemed to share consciousness in ways that made individual counting irrelevant. Detective Pizarro made notes, but he was increasingly certain that conventional investigative methods weren't adequate for this case. Sienna, he said, setting down his pen, I need you to understand something. The story you're telling, beings from other dimensions, temples that exist outside normal time, consciousness that transcends individual identity. It's not something I can put in an official report. I know. So help me find an explanation that I can put in a report. Because right now, the alternative explanations are kidnapping, human trafficking, psychological break from isolation. Those are investigations I know how to conduct. Sienna looked at him with eyes that held a sadness deeper than her personal ordeal. What if the truth doesn't fit into your available categories? Before Pizarro could answer, Dr. Vasquez burst into the interview room, her face flushed with excitement and concern. We have a problem, she announced. The temple site, it's gone. The satellite images were conclusive. The coordinates where Miguel Santos had discovered the temple entrance showed nothing but solid rock face. No opening. No cave. No signs that human beings had ever set foot on that particular section of the mountain. It's not possible, Miguel insisted, studying the photographs. I've been to that exact location. We all have. There were carved passages, chambers, artifacts. The GPS coordinates match, Dr. Vasquez confirmed, but there's nothing there. It's as if the entire complex just sealed itself. Johan Eriksson, the photographer, pulled out his digital camera and scrolled through the images he'd captured inside the temple. The screen showed nothing but error messages, corrupted files, data that had somehow degraded beyond recovery in the 5 days since the discovery. My memory cards are fine, he said, checking and rechecking his equipment. I've never seen anything like this. It's as if something actively erased the data. That evening, alone in her hotel room in Juarez, Sienna Caldwell opened her leather journal to the final entry she'd made before leaving the temple. The page was blank. As she watched, words began to appear in her own handwriting, forming sentences she didn't remember composing. The first phase is complete. The observer has returned with initial data. Prepare for expanded contact protocols. Beneath that, in handwriting that wasn't quite human, a single line. Thank you for your service, Dr. Caldwell. The real work begins now. Outside her window, in the thin mountain air above Juarez, lights moved against the stars in patterns that followed no known flight paths, no recognizable aircraft configurations. The lights pulsed in rhythm with something that might have been communication, might have been celebration, or might have been an arrival. Dr. Sienna Caldwell didn't sleep that night. She sat by the hotel window watching the lights move across the sky in patterns that seemed almost conversational, and tried to understand what was happening to her memories. The journal entries were changing. Not just the final page. Entire sections were rewriting themselves, Her careful documentation of 7 years transforming into something else, something that made her question whether she'd ever really understood what had happened to her in the temple. At 3:17 a.m., her satellite phone rang. The caller ID showed only numbers, coordinates, she realized, for a location in the Amazon basin 600 miles southeast of Juarez. "Dr. Caldwell," said a voice she didn't recognize. American accent, professional tone. "My name is Dr. James Morrison, Smithsonian Institution. We need to talk." "It's 3 in the morning." "Yes. And in approximately 4 hours, there will be a significant development that will make this conversation impossible to have through normal channels. I'm in the lobby of your hotel. May I come up?" Sienna looked out at the lights in the sky, still pulsing their incomprehensible message. "Room 247, she said. Dr. Morrison was a tall man in his 50s with the kind of deep tan that came from decades of fieldwork in equatorial climates. He carried a briefcase that looked ordinary except for the electronic locks and the way he never let it leave his sight. "The Smithsonian doesn't have an official position on extraterrestrial contact," he said, settling into the room's single chair. "Officially, we catalog and preserve artifacts of human civilization, but we also maintain certain consultancy relationships with agencies that handle phenomena outside conventional academic categories. You're telling me the government knows about what happened to me. I'm telling you that what happened to you isn't unprecedented, though it may be the most thoroughly documented case we've encountered." He gestured toward her journal, which lay open on the bedside table. "May I?" Sienna handed him the journal, watching his face as he read passages that had rewritten themselves while she slept. "Fascinating," he murmured. "The handwriting transitions are seamless. Most subjects experience much more dramatic alterations to their documentation. Your training as an archaeologist may have provided some protection against memory modification." "Memory modification?" "Dr. Caldwell, what I'm about to tell you will sound like science fiction, but I need you to understand that we're operating with limited information based on 37 years of investigating similar incidents. The beings you encountered appear to be conducting some form of anthropological study of human civilization. They select individuals with specific expertise, archaeologists, historians, linguists, occasionally artists, and subject them to extended observation periods." Dr. Morrison opened his briefcase and removed a series of photographs. Similar temples in remote locations around the world, Tibet, the Canadian Arctic, the Australian outback, and in each location, evidence of the same impossible metallurgy, the same architectural precision, the same artifacts that challenged basic assumptions about what was possible with pre-industrial technology. "The pattern goes back centuries," he continued, "sometimes millennia, but something has changed in the last decade. The frequency of contact events has increased dramatically, and for the first time, they're sending subjects back with explicit instructions to share their experiences." "Instructions?" "Check your journal again." Sienna looked down at the leather-bound book. New text was appearing even as she watched, filling blank pages with information she'd never consciously learned. Star charts showing not just Earth's sky, but the skies of other worlds. Technical diagrams of technologies that wouldn't be invented for centuries. And at the bottom of each page, the same message repeated in dozens of languages: "Prepare for integration." "They're not studying us anymore, Doctor," Morrison said quietly. "They're preparing us. The question is for what?" Before Sienna could respond, her satellite phone rang again. This time, the caller ID was blank. "Answer it," Dr. Morrison said. Detective Pizarro's voice came through the speaker, but there was something wrong with the sound quality. An echo that suggested vast spaces, impossible acoustics. "Sienna," he said, and his words seemed to come from very far away. "You need to get out of there. Now. Don't go to the airport. Don't use main roads. They're coming for you." "Who's coming?" "Everyone. Peruvian military, international agencies, people who want the artifacts, people who want to bury the artifacts. Word is out about what you brought down from that mountain. Half the world wants to study it. The other half wants to make it disappear." The line went dead. Outside, the lights in the sky were descending. "Doctor." Morrison was already packing his briefcase. "We have maybe 20 minutes before this area is locked down. There's a helicopter on the roof, not official, Not on any flight manifest. If you want answers, if you want to understand what really happened to you, you need to come with me now. Sienna looked at her journal, at the pages still writing themselves with information that felt both foreign and familiar. 7 years of her life documented in handwriting that was hers, but somehow more than hers. 7 years of contact with beings who existed outside the categories of human understanding, and now they wanted her to share what she'd learned. Where are we going? Somewhere they can't follow, not yet anyway, somewhere the conditions aren't right for their kind of intervention. Doctor, Morrison headed for the door. The Amazon. Deep enough that satellite coverage is intermittent, remote enough that official agencies can't move quickly, and close enough to the coordinates they gave you that we might finally get some answers. The helicopter ride took 6 hours following flight paths that avoided official air traffic control. Below them, the Peruvian landscape transitioned from mountain peaks to jungle canopy, from sparse population to absolute wilderness. Dr. Morrison spent most of the flight on encrypted radio calls, speaking in code with people Sienna couldn't identify. They landed at a research station that officially didn't exist, a collection of prefabricated buildings hidden beneath triple canopy rainforest, supplied by drops that never appeared on any manifest, staffed by scientists whose research never made it into academic journals. "Welcome to Station Prometheus, Doctor," Morrison said as they climbed out of the helicopter, "where we study the things that don't fit into conventional categories." The station's director was Dr. Elena Santos, a xenoarchaeologist whose work on anomalous artifacts had been quietly funded by a consortium of universities and government agencies for the past 15 years. She greeted Sienna with the kind of professional excitement that suggested she'd been waiting for this meeting for a very long time. "Dr. Caldwell," she said, shaking hands with genuine enthusiasm, "your preliminary reports have raised questions we've been investigating for decades. We need to understand. The beings you encountered, did they ever discuss their relationship with similar sites around the world?" Over the next 3 days, Sienna found herself at the center of the most comprehensive debriefing she'd ever experienced. Teams of specialists, linguists, physicists, neurologists, anthropologists worked with her to decode the information that had been implanted in her memory, to understand the technology that had been demonstrated to her, to map the implications of what she'd experienced. What they discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about human history. "The temples aren't just archaeological sites," Dr. Santos explained during one of their evening briefings. "They're interfaces, communication nodes in a network that spans the globe and extends back thousands of years. The beings you met, they're not visitors in the traditional sense. They're coordinators, managing a relationship with human civilization that has been ongoing since before recorded history." The evidence was overwhelming once you knew what to look for. Anomalous artifacts in museums around the world, all showing the same impossible metallurgy, the same mathematical precision, the same design principles that defied conventional understanding of technological development. Ancient texts that described contact with beings from the sky, but with details too specific and too consistent across cultures to be dismissed as mythology. And increasingly modern disappearances that followed the same pattern as Sienna's experience. "You're not the only one, Doctor," Morrison told her on the fourth evening as they sat on the station's observation deck listening to the sounds of the jungle around them. "In the last 10 years, we've documented 47 similar cases. Researchers, academics, occasionally artists or writers, people with the intellectual framework to understand and document complex information. They disappear for months or years, then return with knowledge they couldn't possibly have acquired through normal means. But why now? If this relationship has been ongoing for millennia, why the sudden increase in contact?" Dr. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the canopy overhead, where occasional lights moved in patterns that had become familiar over the past few days. "Because something is changing," he said finally. "The rate of human technological development, the density of our population, the extent of our environmental impact, we're approaching some kind of threshold, and they need to prepare us for what comes next." That's when Sienna showed him the final section of her journal, the pages that had filled themselves the night before with information that made her hands shake as she read it. The integration wasn't a distant possibility. It was already beginning. Around the world, the temples were activating. The hidden sites that had been dormant for centuries were coming online, their ancient technologies interfacing with modern communication networks, their alien architectures extending into dimensions that human science was only beginning to understand. And the people who had been selected, who had undergone the observation process, who had returned with modified consciousness and expanded awareness, they were the advanced team, the translators, the bridge between two forms of consciousness that had been slowly converging for millennia. They're not invading, Sienna realized, looking at the star charts that had appeared in her journal, showing Earth's position relative to other nodes in a network that spanned the galaxy. They're graduating us, moving human civilization to the next level of development. The satellite phone rang at exactly midnight. This time, there was no caller ID at all. "Dr. Caldwell," said a voice that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite electronic, but somehow managed to be both familiar and impossible. "The preliminary phase is complete. Are you prepared for the next stage?" Sienna looked around at the team of scientists who had become her colleagues, her friends, her fellow conspirators in understanding something that would change everything humanity believed about itself. "What happens to the people who aren't ready?" "Nothing happens to them," the voice replied. "They continue to exist as they always have in the dimensions they currently occupy, but you and others like you will have access to expanded reality, enhanced perception, the ability to experience existence as we do, across multiple temporal and spatial dimensions. And if I say no, you return to your previous life. Your memories of the temple experience fade to half-remembered dreams. You publish papers on conventional archaeology, teach undergraduate courses, grow old in the reality you've always known. It is not a punishment. It is simply limited." Outside, the lights were descending again. But this time, Sienna could see them clearly. Not spacecraft in any conventional sense, but tiers in reality itself. Openings between dimensions that allowed travel across distances that had no meaning in human physics. "Dr. Caldwell." "Doctor," Morrison said quietly. "Whatever you decide, you need to know that this moment, this choice, it's what everything has been building toward. Not just your 7 years in the temple, centuries of contact, thousands of years of preparation, human consciousness evolving to the point where integration is possible." Sienna opened her journal one last time. The pages were blank except for a single question, written in her own handwriting. "What do you choose?" She looked at Dr. Santos, at Dr. Morrison, at the team of scientists who had dedicated their careers to understanding phenomena that existed outside conventional academic categories. She thought about Detective Pizarro, about Miguel Santos, about all the people who had touched her story and been changed by it. And she thought about the beings who had kept her for 7 years, who had shared their knowledge and their perspective and their understanding of reality as something far more complex and beautiful than human science had ever imagined. "I choose integration," she said. The lights descended and reality opened like a flower, revealing dimensions that had always been there, waiting for human consciousness to evolve enough to perceive them. Dr. Sienna Caldwell stepped through the opening between worlds and disappeared into a form of existence that had no name in any human language. Behind her, she left her journal, its pages now filled with star charts and technical diagrams and philosophical frameworks that would take human science centuries to understand. And on the final page, written in handwriting that belonged to no human author, the integration has begun. Welcome to the expanded universe. The next morning, Station Prometheus reported a complete systems failure. All electronic equipment had shut down simultaneously at 12:07 a.m. All written records had been mysteriously corrupted. All personnel reported identical dreams of vast spaces and impossible geometries, and a sense of profound change occurring just beyond the edge of perception. Dr. Sienna Caldwell was listed as missing, presumed lost in the Amazon jungle during a routine research expedition. But sometimes in remote locations around the world, archaeologists and researchers report finding artifacts that shouldn't exist. Pieces of impossible technology. Star charts showing skies that human telescopes have never observed. And always, accompanying these discoveries, a sense that something wonderful and terrible and utterly transformative is beginning. The temples remain hidden. The integration continues. And somewhere in dimensions that human language cannot describe, Dr. Sienna Caldwell is learning what it means to exist beyond the boundaries of ordinary reality. The real work has begun.